Hi boys and girls, we're going to continue using fractions on a number line. However, we're going to start using more than one whole. So you'll need a sheet of paper and a pencil because this can be a tricky skill, and I really think it's important that you practice this with me today. The first thing we need to do is review what a number line looks like with fractions on it. So you might remember that number lines typically have arrows on each end because they're continuous. That means they never end. We see our end and our start and our end points by putting our tick marks. In the past, we were used to practicing like this, and we would say that this number line is worth one whole. However, the difference is now we're going to be cutting this number line into more than one whole. And so in order to do that, we're going to put some other lines labeled with holes. So for example, let's say I want this number line to show the distance between 0 and 2 holes. So I'm going to put 1 here and 2 here. If you want to look at this carefully, you'll see that this is one hole and this is another one. Some students might look at this number line and immediately say, oh, those are halves. The reason why it's not cut into halves, even though there are two parts, is because you have to now zoom in and look at just each part as one whole. This is one whole and this is one whole. So now let's say I wanted to cut my number line into thirds. In the past, whenever you had a regular number line, it was easy. You would say, oh, I need to cut into thirds. I just cut it into 3 parts. And I label it like that: 0 thirds, 1 third, 2 thirds, 3 thirds, piece of cake. Here's the difference. Now, this old number line that we were used to drawing is basically becoming part of a bigger number line. So we're still going to need to have this cut into thirds. However, it's just going to keep extending. So let's do that. Let's bring it down and show how we would do this. If I need to cut this into thirds, I would immediately say to myself, okay, I'm going to look at the distance between 0 and 1, and I'm going to cut it into 3 equal parts. So I'm going to put my 2 lines here. That shows 1 part, 2 parts, 3 parts. And I'm going to label 0 thirds, 1 third, 2 thirds, 3 thirds. That's my one whole. Remember, the rule is if you have the same numerator and denominator, it's equal to one whole. Now, if I want to continue my number line, I can add 2 more tick marks to cut 3 more parts, because remember, each whole has to be cut into thirds, and I can continue my counting. 4 thirds, 5 thirds, 6 thirds. I'm going to give you a little trick to check your work. Here's what you can do. I like to take my top number and divide it by my bottom number. And if it works out, that's how you figure out your holes. Watch what I do, okay? If I take 3 things and I divide them by 3, I end up with 1. If I take 6 and I divide it by 3, I end up with 2. It's just like this. If one whole has 3 parts and 2 holes has 6 parts, you'll notice that 3 thirds are colored in for one whole and 6 thirds are colored in for 2 holes. So again, when you are doing fractions on a number line with more than one whole, you should always stop and say to yourself, wait a minute, did I label these correctly? Let me show you an example of a student who might have labeled them incorrectly and how the student would be able to figure out that there was a mistake. Let's say the student started labeling and was like, oh, okay, I'm doing thirds. 1 third, 2 thirds, 3 thirds, 4 thirds. And I always say to my students, stop at your hole and just make sure you're counting correctly. And the student says, okay, 4 divided by 3 does not work. You can't take 4 things and divide them into 3 equal groups. It does not work, which means there's no way that I labeled my parts correctly, and I have to erase and start over. Let's do another example. On this one, we're going to put 0 holes, 1 hole, 2 holes, 3 holes. Ooh, we're going to cut this one. Each of these holes is going to be cut into halves. Okay, so if we're cutting them into halves, that means we're going to be cutting each one into 2 equal pieces. So there's 1 cut, 2 cuts, 3 cuts to show each of my holes cut in half. And I know if I see halves, I know that means 2 parts. So 2 is going to be my denominator for every single one of these. I start with 0 halves, 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves. Let's draw a picture and make sure we're doing this correctly. No holes, can't draw a picture. 1 hole, let's stop at 1 hole and see what it looks like. If 1 hole has 2 halves colored in, we know we did it right. 1 hole is the same as 2 halves. Okay, let's try this one. Is 2 holes the same as 4 halves? 1, 2, 3, 4. It is. We did it correctly. Let's try this one. Let's see if 3 holes is the same as 6 halves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It is. You'll see I have a 0, I have 1 hole, and I have 2 holes. So now we're going to start to think about how will we partition this number line differently than we did before. Well, first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we would partition this into thirds. Remember, the word partition means to cut apart or break apart. And we're going to be breaking apart this number line into thirds. Now, some kids might say, wait, but we have 2 halves already. That's the problem with that is these are not actually halves. The hole is right here. And I'm going to just take my marker so you can really see it. This is 1 hole. And then this is another hole. So now what we have to do is we have to break each of those holes into thirds. So you're going to cut. I usually put like a little dot just to make sure my spacing is good before I draw my lines. And then once I'm happy with it, I go ahead and draw my lines. What I just did was I cut this hole into thirds. The distance between 0 and 1 is 3 parts or thirds. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the distance between 1 and 2. I cut that into thirds as well. A common mistake is students will count 6 parts and they'll think that this is cut into 6. However, you have to pay very close attention to your holes. It is not 6 because you're only looking at the distance between each hole. Now, the way that you would label this number line is like this. You start with your 0 thirds, 1 third, 2 thirds, 3 thirds, 4 thirds, 5 thirds, 6 thirds. You're going to notice right away that 0 is the same as 0 thirds, 1 is the same as 3 thirds, and 2 is the same as 6 thirds. Here's your quick check to see if you're doing this correctly. If you see that you take your top number and you divide it by your bottom number, you should get the whole. For example, 3 divided by 3 is 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2.